Welcome back to the Convo Couch, ladies and gentlemen. I am Pasta Jardula, and today I have a great guest with me. Live from South Florida is Tim Canova, who ran for District 23 in South Florida twice against Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Tim, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Craig.
Well, I didn't hear you there for a second, but I saw your lips, and it said, things are doing great. We got you plugged back in.
Okay.
There we go. So listen, I've been wanting to speak to you about something because even though you're not, are you running again, first of all? Have you made a decision to run or not? Let's let the people know.
I've made no decision. After two races in which it certainly seems like both races were rigged in one way or another, it's hard to imagine running until they fix the election system here.
Well, let's not talk so much about the election. Let's talk about the system itself, because I think that's where you're an expert. A lot of people put the cart before the horse. There's a lot of red herrings out there. And on this particular show, me and my partner always scream about immigration and the way it's not tied to regime change. We feel like it's not talked about a lot. And when it comes to voting, everybody keeps talking about paper ballots. But you're an expert on this, Tim. Isn't there something to be said about open source versus closed source? And maybe you can unpack a little bit of that for our audience.
Sure. Well, first, I used to live in California, and when I voted there, I voted absentee from what I remember. Here in Florida, all over the state, when somebody votes, it's on a paper ballot that is, excuse me a moment. Sorry about that.
I was what's going on there?
That's my cat named Julian. Julian just adopted me, a neighborhood cat.
Awesome.
I'm sorry about that distraction. So here, you vote on paper ballots. If you vote early voting, absentee, you mail in the paper ballot. And, of course, they then put it through a scanning machine to tabulate the vote. If you vote in person, once you fill out the ballot, you hand it to an election worker who, right before your eyes, feeds it through an electronic scanning machine. Now, imagine if that that election worker simply tore up your ballot in front of you. Mm-hmm. You'd be crying for the police to arrest that person.
Absolutely.
Well, there are other ways to cheat you out of your vote. One way would be to rig the electronic source code, the source code of the software. And that's exactly what we believe happened in our last, well, actually, probably in both elections. And when I say we believe, it's people who are much more expert on the technical aspect than I am. I'm not an expert. I've read a lot of the literature, and I certainly listen to what the experts have said after analyzing the data. So if bad actors, whether it's outside hackers or somebody within the system, has changed the source code, they can change the final vote, of course. If it's, and we brought a lawsuit after the 2016 primary to inspect the ballots because we didn't believe the results. And those ballots were then destroyed. So
yes,
either they destroy them in front of you or they destroy them when they're supposedly supposed to store them. Either way, of course, those are, criminal ways to cover up a rigging. When we brought a lawsuit under Florida's public records statute to inspect the ballots, we also asked to inspect the software that was used. And of course, we were met with a stone wall, like basically everyone who's ever sought to inspect the software in these elections, because the software itself is considered proprietary. The private property and trade secrets of the private vendor, and we're talking about gigantic corporations. There's only 5 or 6.
Microsoft?
This was ES&S, Electronic Systems and Software. And ES&S bought up the assets of the notorious Diebold firm from years ago. So ES&S is not about to share their software. They say it's closed source, it's proprietary, it's trade secrets. Florida election officials are allowed to inspect it, but even if they inspect it, the source code they think is being used can be tampered with just for a very discrete amount of time. So these electronic scanning machines that our paper ballots are fed through to tabulate the vote to scan them, to take a scanned image. Every one of those electronic scanning machines in Florida also contains wireless cellular modems, which is, I mean, ludicrous. It means an
Wait a
outside
second. Just wireless. So
wireless cellular modems. Yes.
No.
Yes. Yes.
So they can fix it from Tennessee and Florida.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
let me just really, what does open source actually mean then? Because I heard about these elections in Venezuela where people talk about them, they were so awful, but yet I heard Kevin Zeese, who was over there, who say they have an open source system where it's the people's audit. They can come in, they have access to the machines, they understand how it works, and therefore there's no secrets.
I'm less optimistic about open source than Kevin and some others. And again, if you had open source software on the machines here in Florida, it means that you can inspect the code before the vote, you can inspect the code after the vote, but what you don't have control of, even with open source, is what is the source code during the tabulation itself.
Okay.
Somebody can hack in, change the source code, and listen, the experts believe that in my last election here, when I ran as an independent, that it would have only taken manipulating 5 or 6 lines of source code to pin me at the same low percentage for every demographic group, which, you know, the experts say it was statistically impossible, but that's what the results were. So in other words, a hacker can come in, change the source code once the polls close, once the actual tabulation occurs electronically, and maybe that takes half an hour. And then after the tabulation, the electronic tabulation is complete, they can then leave the system without any footprints that the source code has been changed.
Wow. Oh, okay. Even if we switch to open source now, there's still more going down the rabbit hole to make sure that we secure our elections. What is the solution then if it's not, if open source is just not going to fix the problem? What else can we do, or what else do we have to do? Because we have talked about during election time signing up to be a poll volunteer to get as many eyes out there. Specifically what we saw in Florida with the trucks coming in and all the ballots being loaded on in your elections. We said we're just going to flood with volunteers. Our eyes and ears are going to be open. Our cameras are going to be on. But now we're hearing about the open source versus closed source. So you're saying we have to take it even another step forward? Even if we get open source, there's still more to do?
Yes. I'm sorry to say, I don't think...
You're ruining my day, Tim. I mean, I get to one thing, I keep getting to the next, and now it's... What do we have to do, Tim?
Well, we really have to follow the lead of most European democracies and what the United States did for 200 years and count our paper ballots by hand in public. That's the only real way to have a transparent and verifiable voting system. The ballots need to be counted where they are cast in the local precincts, in public. In this day and age, that means anyone with a cell phone camera should be allowed to videotape and photograph the counting process. But that's the only way to have a transparent system. Paper ballots that are hand marked and counted by hand in public at the local precinct level, and the results reported immediately.
Let me play devil's advocate for a second.
Yes.
But that's going to cost too much money, Tim. We can't even afford health care or get our people off the streets. You know how much money it's going to cost to have live, actual people counting ballots at a station? How can we pull that off?
Well, my guess is it would cost less than what governments at every level, federal, state, and local, are spending for these 5 or 6 huge vending companies that provide the electronic infrastructure, the electronic machines, and the software. So if we put our resources to paper ballots, my guess is if the federal government were would subsidize it the way they subsidize the electronic voting machine industry, they could hire whatever it takes, 100,000, 200,000 Americans for every election day to be at the local precincts, and not to be volunteering, but to actually be paid something to count the ballots for really an evening we're talking about. The polls close and the ballots are counted over the course of an evening. You know, Britain does this. When Britain had the Brexit vote, I think the polls closed around 6 p.m. and it took a while to hand count all those paper ballots. by midnight, they had results. So here, instead of waiting till midnight, we want those results by, half an hour after the election, the polls close. But there's nothing reliable about it. There's nothing transparent or verifiable about it. In Britain, it takes a few more hours, and everyone feels very secure in the results themselves.
So you're saying it is being done, it has been done, and it can be done as long as we have the political will. Is there
and it must be done. It must be done.
It must be done.
Right now we have a system where bad actors, whether it's from outside the system, it could be any of a dozen intelligence agencies throughout the world, foreign or domestic, or bad actors within the system, all have the means, the motive, and the opportunity to rig the electronics, to rig the elections. And so if they have means, motive, and opportunity to rig elections, why wouldn't they do it? Because they're ethical. Now, if you want to believe that, you should still be believing in Santa Claus.
I do believe in Santa Claus. What are the motives?
The motives? Oh, my God.
We know they have the means. We know these people have endless amounts of money. And I want to talk about the bad actors in a second. But what are the motives? And when I talk about motives, let me talk about a guy by the name of David Dill. Are you familiar with that name?
I've heard of David Dill. Why have I heard of him?
The Stanford professor who gets all the grants for all these with these advocacy groups, these nonprofit groups. Well, let's talk about the motives. Let's stick with the motives. What are the motives?
Motives for rigging an election?
Yes. I'm trying to connect the dots to the actual players, who they are. Because we talk about Microsoft, who has all this proprietary information. They have this proprietary ownership. Therefore, they don't want to share the information. What are the major motives? Does this go all the way up to the top of the hill of the elites and the oligarchs fixing these elections?
Probably. Look, I would imagine Microsoft and ES&S and the electronic vendors, their motives are just to keep the system the way it is because it means profits coming in. It means a revenue stream that's guaranteed. But I'm not saying they are the ones actually rigging the elections, although, these vendors have the means, motive, and opportunity. If it's an intelligence agency, foreign or domestic, private or public, that is rigging elections, the motives, of course, I would think, are to put anti-corporate types of candidates in the loss column. They want to make sure that whoever's winning elections are pretty much those who are going to be part of the corporate agenda. I don't think it's that complicated why elections would be rigged and who they'd be rigged for. Now, you could rig them for Democrats, you could rig them for Republicans. The example I started with, in Florida, you hand your ballot, your paper ballot, to an election worker who should be right in front of your eyes, putting it through the scanning machine. Instead, suppose he or she rips up your ballot. I mean, that's outrageous. Everyone would say there should be a criminal prosecution. And it's outrageous if they're doing it based on your race, based on your gender, based on your political party. We'd all be outraged. But apparently, if it's a primary and they're tearing up the ballot of somebody challenging a Democrat, we should keep our mouths shut, fall in line, and get behind the Democrat who it was rigged for, because the alternative is a terrible Republican. Yeah. I mean, that's the mindset that we've had now for many years. And it played out really in very negative ways, not just in my 2016 campaign, but of course in the presidential primaries as well.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people are not putting their eye on the ball, and why I wanted to talk to you today, because I know my audience, they are really concerned about election integrity. I know the MCSE network audience, Nico's audience, they are very concerned about election integrity. And a lot of Bernie supporters, and I've talked to a Bernie staffer, and I can't name who, at the KDM convention. I said, well, aren't you a little bit concerned that they might cheat him again? And the answer was, well, we're going to give him another shot. And I think the mindset is, Tim, is that the support for Sanders is going to be so overwhelming, so much, that the cheating that they did was selective and small, that this time it's going to be a tsunami and it's going to be too much for them to stop. But that's not the case, is it?
I wish I could believe in that scenario. I don't. Fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me, right?
George Bush couldn't get that right. I'm glad you did.
Exactly. I was worried for a moment.
You went slow on it. I saw.
Yeah. Look, we really believe they stole the 2016 primary for me at this point. I didn't want to be so direct and say that for a long time, but our final field numbers showed me crushing Wasserman Schultz, and they were based on 10 to 12,000 door knocks a week by a huge field operation, 200 souls knocking on doors in 4 field offices. And then, you know, the experts analyze the data. They do these cumulative voter tallies. They see these statistical anomalies, these patterns that suggest a flipping of the vote through software manipulation.
Yeah.
And finally, I say, okay, let's put in a request to inspect the ballots, and they throw out the ballots.
Yeah.
Okay. So that happens in 2016, that primary. We went at it again, just the way Bernie folks are going at it again. I respect them for running. I wish them well. But to think it won't happen again, we fully expected when the supervisor of elections of Broward never got prosecuted for destroying ballots. You know, that's not.
She kept her job, in fact.
That's not the rule of law that applies to everyone. Instead, that's rigging elections with impunity.
Yeah.
So that's an open invitation to do it again. And, you know, we expected it again. I ran as an independent the second time. A week or two before the election, a Republican news outlet, the Floridian Press, published a report stating that there was a Republican poll out there that had me and Wasserman Schultz tied at 34% each, and the Republican way back in third at 13%. So we gained momentum after that report. There were a lot of Republicans who suddenly thought this is the chance to get Wasserman Schultz out of power. And there were a lot of Democrats who thought, you know, we're not going to surrender a seat to a Republican by voting for Canova. And we had a big surge happening at the end. We fully believed we were neck and neck with Wasserman Schultz with a good chance to pull it out. The polls closed. An hour later, we got 5% of the total. That's the official result. And it ends up 5% regardless of demographics. 5% among blacks, whites, Hispanics, male, female, Democrats, non-Democrats.
Yeah.
That's what's statistically impossible, according to the experts. So, you know, they ripped us off a second time. Now, I would just love it, of course, if, you know, the Bernie Sanders staffer you spoke to is correct, and, you know, Sanders has such a tsunami of support that they can't possibly rip him off again. I just think that's wishful thinking and a bit naive.
Well, what do we do? First of all, I have 2 questions, and let me connect them.
Yeah.
Number one is, are there any exit poll numbers from your last primary to help that we can also take a look at? And number 2 is, in a state like Florida, because even though I'm in California, I'm from Florida. I went to school right down the street from you. And in a state like Florida, where the Democrats and Republicans just protect each other, what do we do?
These are tough questions. Let me take them one at a time. First of all, in 2016, you'll recall Bernie Sanders, in about a dozen states, primaries, he won the exit polls.
Yes.
And yet he lost the official results in those states. And what was the reaction of the media at that point?
Stop doing them.
They canceled doing the exit polls.
Yes.
Exactly. So nobody did exit polls in my race. I didn't have the money to do exit polls. I raised maybe $500,000 and put it all on the ground, and put a lot of my own money in both these races, and could not afford exit polls. The polls before the election, I mentioned that one report of a Republican poll, and I had heard through the grapevine that the Republican National Committee was doing a lot of polling down here at one point, and that Wasserman Schultz couldn't break out of the 30s, that her negative numbers were just so sky high, and she couldn't pull out of the 30s. I couldn't afford to do a poll beforehand. I was putting my money elsewhere, but Wasserman Schultz was swimming in all kinds of money, and corporate money, of course. And I have no doubt that they were polling regularly here. And it's telling that Wasserman Schultz's side didn't publish a single poll. So what does that tell you?
Now, there's some serious trickery going on over there.
Of course. And it's bad enough when the election supervisor is destroying the ballots as I described. But you've got a Department of Justice that has never investigated. You've got local U.S. attorneys here in Miami, in South Florida. They have not investigated. You've got this Florida's Department of Law Enforcement has not investigated. These are law enforcement agencies in Republican hands.
Yeah.
So under those circumstances, why have any confidence in any election results whatsoever? At the federal level or within
State
any
level. Yeah.
You can't count on the feds, the Justice Department, to even investigate mass destruction of ballots.
Yeah.
And so what does it tell you about the two parties? It's really what Ralph Nader used to always say.
One party,
two different heads.
Party. Yeah.
They cover for each other. They wash each other's dirty laundry. And what's their goal? Their goal is to keep any critics of the corporate establishment out.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, you would think that in a state like like Florida, that you'd have people like DeSantis and the ex-governor Scott wanting to put Debbie Wasserman Schultz behind bars, but it's just a smokescreen. And I really found that out, and I really kind of felt that way when I saw that Lanny Davis was defending Michael Cohen. I was like, oh, this is just one big club here. They're just going around in one big circle, and it kind of explains the situation in Florida where they have a chance to really hang Debbie Wasserman Schultz, but they don't. And in fact, escapes everything, and I believe it's Wanda Sykes, is it, or is it Brenda Sykes?
Brenda Snipes.
Brenda Snipes, excuse me. That also just gets to continue keeping her job, but is not put behind bars.
Well, I'll tell you this: she destroyed the ballots. We called for a criminal investigation in 2018, and Governor Rick Scott would do nothing. Okay, the Republicans fell silent suddenly, and it got back to me through my Republican election lawyer, because I couldn't find a Democrat who wasn't conflicted out, that the reason the Republicans were doing nothing is that they had the same corporate backers as Debbie, and everyone would be happier with Debbie in office than me. Now, when the November 2018 election occurred, of course, there was sort of a double train wreck in Broward County. The U.S. Senate race between Governor Rick Scott and Senator Bill Nelson, as well as the governor's race between Andrew Gillum and Ron DeSantis, all crashed in Broward County.
Yeah.
And that's finally when, Brenda Snipes came under some kind of scrutiny, and she ended up losing her job. Okay. Governor Scott ended up firing her, but, she was reinstated by DeSantis, who allowed her to retire, to resign.
Yeah.
So she continues to receive $130,000 a year pension for the rest of her life, instead of facing criminal prosecution. And I'm not a vindictive guy, generally speaking, but, tampering with elections and destroying ballots is certainly a criminal matter that should be investigated and prosecuted. And if you prosecute it, you don't know what you will learn. If Brenda Snipes and some of her top lieutenants are facing jail time, and we're talking about felonies punishable by up to 5 years in prison for destroying these ballots, perhaps they would start singing and cooperating and casting more light on the motives for destroying the ballots, what was being hidden, how a rig would have occurred. And none of that occurs so far. Now, DeSantis is still somewhat new to office as governor. We have, a few weeks back, we put out a call for supporters to call Governor DeSantis and to ask him to do two things. One is to appoint a special state attorney to investigate Brenda Snipes. Awesome. And the other is to have that special state attorney investigate why the state attorney in Broward County has done nothing. Okay? And DeSantis's office in Tallahassee was flooded with telephone calls for a solid week. So he's aware of this case. And I know the U.S. Civil Rights Commission is about to hold hearings. The statute of limitations for the destruction of these ballots does not expire until 2021. We're still hoping that there's going to be some justice and the rule of law applied.
Well, it just seems like Debbie Wasserman Schultz has protection from the highest among highest. I mean, her name has been floated out there. Even the situation with didn't she have like it was like an engineer or something that fled the country and that used to work for him?
Yeah,
What's that? Can you give us a little update on that case? Has anything come about that? I remember she was yelling at the state police and almost threatening the Capitol
the
policeman
Capitol Police. Yeah,
to give
exactly.
back the computer. Can you give us a little unpacking of that case?
Sure. There's a great book on this by a right of center journalist named I'm sorry, Rosiak, Luke Rosiak, and it's called Obstruction of Justice. And I've read it, and I kept up with the case as it was happening, of course. What happened was Wasserman Schultz had hired an IT guy named Imran Awan, a Pakistani-born IT guy who didn't have a lot of IT experience, and somehow ended up not just running Wasserman Schultz's IT, but through her, handling the IT support for 44 Democrats, I believe, in the House of Representatives, including, I believe, just about everyone on the House Intelligence Committee. Now, what came out through not just Rosiak's investigation, but I should say the House Inspector General investigated this in 2016 and 17. In August of 2016, the House Inspector General concluded that Imran Awan had violated all kinds of cybersecurity protocols, and in fact was accessing the House server, those
Really?
the emails and files of 44 House members, including the Intelligence Committee, from Pakistan, when Awan was in Pakistan for many months. So you got to wonder who in Pakistan might be interested in spying on the House Intelligence Committee, and who in the U.S. might they be working with. And
can you give me some conclusions?
Well, no. Unfortunately, the Justice Department under Sessions reached some kind of ridiculous plea bargain with Imran Awan, where he pled guilty to like one count of bank fraud, and the cybersecurity violations just disappeared into thin air. Now, I have heard through the grapevine, I think it's out there on social media now, that the Justice Department is now taking another look at this. And
okay.
Of course, the Justice Department is taking a look at how the FISA warrants were issued, how the Justice Department came to get permission from a FISA court to spy on the Trump campaign. So there's an awful lot of backlash or boomerang about to happen that might implicate an awful lot of Democrats who were high up in the Obama administration and maybe even connected to Wasserman Schultz. So this has not necessarily played out completely.
Oh, and then they got the Epstein case coming on now too as well. But we also know that Barr has some ties as well to the whole situation. I don't want to jump into that story right now, but they have a lot of things to look at, the Justice Department. So there's a lot of red herrings. There's a lot of distractions. But that's why I wanted to do this show with you today, Tim, because we have to get back to election integrity and keep talking about it. Now, you guys made calls to DeSantis' office. You flooded his phones. As Americans, sitting in California, sitting in Texas, sitting in Michigan, sitting wherever, what could we do today to help our election integrity process and get us on to the point where we'll have honest elections here in America?
Well, first, I'd like to thank my supporters. We put out an email to my list of supporters, and I'd also like to thank the Movement for a People's Party, who put out an email to their supporters, to their members. And I'd like to thank Jill Stein, who messaged on this quite vigorously. And combined between our supporters and the Movement for a People's Party and Jill Stein's network, we really did flood Governor DeSantis' office with phone calls. I would suggest people continue to call Governor DeSantis' office and tell them how important it is that he appoint a special state attorney to investigate the ballot destruction. This was a wholesale mass ballot destruction. It shouldn't be swept under the rug. If we're going to have equal justice under the law, this is exactly what needs to be investigated and prosecuted. Folks could call Governor Ron DeSantis' office at the following number, 850-717-9337. Again, that's 850-717-9337. Now, I believe his office hours are basically Monday to Friday around 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. But I think those calls have gotten his attention, and we're going to continue to advocate for an actual investigation. You know, if we just sort of turn the other cheek or let this kind of felony ballot destruction go by the wayside without an investigation, then we're complicit in all of this. And, without real, fair, honest, transparent, verifiable elections, you can't really have a democracy. It's just having faith in a system that doesn't warrant our trust at all.
Well, Tim, at this time, what I want to do is just ask my audience. I want to take one question from each audience for you. I want to thank you for coming on with me. My last question for you is there any candidate out there? Is there any politician? Is there anybody out there that's got a bill that can save our election integrity?
Well,
I did look at Tulsi Gabbard's bill.
Yeah.
It does mention open source. It does talk about a paper trail.
Yes.
And now I see some people are trying to mimic that, but it's not necessarily coming through.
Yeah, I think Tulsi Gabbard's effort is probably the most noteworthy one that I've seen so far. And even though maybe it's taking a somewhat pragmatic approach, instead of trying to ban these electronic voting machines, it's saying if we're going to have these electronic voting machines, let's have open source software. But in addition, must have a paper trail. So I applaud Tulsi Gabbard for getting that part of it right. I mean, we need paper trails everywhere, whether it's hand counting of the paper ballots on election evening, which I think is the way to go, or at least, at the very least, to have these paper ballots for audits afterwards. That's absolutely necessary. I saw Elizabeth Warren made a statement, and her statement was very sketchy because it sounded like she was talking about state-of-the-art electronic voting. Well, I'm telling you, the state-of-the-art, it's the art of rigging. As long as you've got electronic voting, they are inherently vulnerable to hacking. And that's not just some left-wing perspective. Kim Zetter, writing for the New York Times, has written several pieces now which reach that conclusion. Electronic voting machines are inherently hackable. They're inherently vulnerable to hacking.
Well, I think Elizabeth Warren is sketchy as is. And when you start speaking in code the way she does, it kind of makes me look the other way. And thank you for your time. I have a lot of watchers on right now. We almost have like over 300 people. Let me get to some questions. I'm going to start on the Facebook. Does anybody have a question for Tim Canova? And here it is. Michael Joseph. What does Tim think about Bernie not endorsing him the second time around?
I think Bernie came under a lot of pressure the first time around. You recall he endorsed me in May of 2016, which our campaign was already on fire. We had already raised $1 million in small donations, and I think we were on a trajectory to win. And I think we may well have won, that they obviously had to rig it and destroy the ballots. Even though he endorsed me in May of 2016 and indicated that he was going to come to Florida and campaign with me and for me, he backed away from that. He came under tremendous pressure from the establishment right around June, I believe, mid or late
Convention
of 2016, and he backed away from taking his fight to the convention, and he endorsed Hillary Clinton. So whatever carrots and sticks came his way, and I think they were very significant ones. I've heard rumors of them, and I'd rather not discuss rumors. Whatever carrots and sticks, I think continued after that election, and so I'm not harshly critical of him for not jumping in and endorsing me in 2018. Would we have liked his endorsement? Of course. But, I never even went looking for his endorsement in 2016. It came out of the blue to us.
Yeah. Well, I think it was your opponent that made it come out of the blue and stuff like that. But we had heard you on NPR. We saw you speak, so I think it was a very earned endorsement. I endorsed you right away when I heard you speak the night they opened up the office in Miami. We were down there for the Cubans for Bernie rally, and it was awesome. So I have a question from the CONVO Couch YouTube, and if you haven't liked, share, and subscribe, please go over and do so if you're on the MCSE network. James Briguski asked, Tim, what is your opinion regarding the virtual caucus scheduled for Nevada and Iowa? Have you heard any about these things? Because these things are getting even more scarier now. You know,
I've only heard a little bit about it, and I haven't been. What I heard when I heard a virtual caucus, I figured it's an online caucus, and I figured it will probably suffer from the same vulnerabilities of electronic primaries. So I'm skeptical of it, but I must plead some ignorance because I haven't drilled down and looked at exactly how they would be run. I'm maybe call me old-fashioned, but again, all over Europe they've gone this way. If we had paper ballots and made election day like a national holiday, where it's our civic duty to, if not volunteer, get paid to count the votes, there'd be no replacement for that. That would be the real way to go to have verifiable elections.
I think that is the way to go. And last question. Thank you so much, Tim. And this is the question. And you know me, I'm a little New York Italian guy, just kind of like you. And I would like you to give me a Vegas odds. Somebody asked a question. What are the chances a progressive will get through the DNC primary? In other words, what are the chances? And I'm going to name the people who I think are the progressives: Bernie, Tulsi, Mike Gravel. And I'll throw Marianne Williamson in there just to give you an extra person in there. Yep. What are the chances if you were setting the odds Vegas style?
And I would have made that same list. I think the world of Mike Gravel. I'm very supportive of Tulsi. Bernie has already proven his bona fides. And Marianne Williamson came and campaigned with me and for me in 2016. I've always been impressed with her.
Yeah.
Look, I think the odds are real high that the DNC, the establishment, will do everything they can to block any of those four to get in. I don't know how to be any more precise than that. I think it's particularly, you could say, a long shot for any of those because of the kind of politics we've had over the last 2 or 3 years. Unfortunately, the Democrats have spent so much time on a Russiagate conspiracy witch hunt. And I know that's the Donald Trump lingo, so I apologize if I'm going to bother people by using a word like...
No apologies on this network. No apologies here.
But
not for that.
I've been called a conspiracy theorist, but please, Rachel Maddow and the establishment, what they've done, they've wasted 2 or 3 years now on this Russiagate stuff, in which if they had put that kind of energy into fixing our election system, said, okay, we accept the results, don't go down the Russiagate rabbit hole, which was always, I think, fiction, and instead demanded that we move to paper ballots, hold hearings, for God's sakes, on all the rigging that was going on. But of course, the Democrats would have had to admit their own culpability, first in rigging the primaries for Hillary Clinton, and they weren't about to do that. So I'm very pessimistic about the prospects for short-term change in the 2020 elections. Of course, I'm hoping, like we all are, but we're at the mercy of some dark forces and an election system that's easy to rig.
Yep. Well, Tim, I want to thank you again for coming on this network and coming to talk to our people and talking about election integrity, because without election integrity, we don't have anything. And let's stay in touch. And when I get out to Florida, you have to take me for some easy yoga, some starter yoga, and we can have some fun and drink some good Cuban coffee together, my friend.
I'll take you to a vegan pizza place as well.
Okay. I get plenty of vegan stuff out here in Cali. So when you come out, likewise. Okay. Thank you again, Tim.
Thank you, Craig.
You can find that on Tim's Twitter. And anything we need to hear. We're going to put the Ron DeSantis stuff up as well so people can call in and call the governor. And we have some work to do in California ourselves. But thank you for joining us again. This is the Convo Couch. I am Pastor Jardula. Tim, you got anything else to say before we...
Just thank you for everything you're doing, Craig. It's so important to get the word out when the mainstream media won't. Shows like yours are so important. And thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
Likewise. And please come on again.
Will do.
For Pastor Jardula, this is the Convo Couch. We have a Patreon, a YouTube, a Twitter. Join us over there, and thank you very much. Johnny Tsunami, Convo out.